Let's begin with a question on COVID. And I'm going to come to you first, Damian, and then some of the other panelists. Emilia asks, what will be the most significant impact of the COVID pandemic for this generation of students?
Wow, well, Emilia, I mean, it's obviously a fantastic question and a really, really important one. I don't think we yet know the answer. That's the honest truth. I mean, sometimes when we talk about what will the effects overall of this period be, I think what it must have been like to have been alive in 1914 coming up to Christmas and somebody said, what do you think are going to be the effects of the current war? And, you know, you wouldn't have said the Bolshevik Revolution, the Easter Rising, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the collapse of domestic service, women's emancipation. You would just have thought about the demise of the Kaiser. And I think when we talk about the disruption, all the change we've had as a result of this virus, there will be huge impacts and we don't know what they will be. For young people and children going through school, I think some of the impacts are quite different depending on what stage you're at, what phase. So think about the very, very youngest children. I mean, so much of your early development, you know, learning to work with other human beings, learning to be kind, to take turns, to share. So much of that comes from being with other children. And so for that generation of very young children, having not had that experience in those formative moments very early in school, I think is very difficult. For others a bit further up the scale, missing out on those key transition moments, you know, you remember what it's like moving from primary school to secondary school and how big a deal that is. We've missed out on some of that. And then, of course, for some of you now, the experience of having worked hard, built up for such a long time to public exams and then not had a chance on the day to show what you can do. That lasts with people for a long time too. And then you go even further. People have had their university time disrupted, you know, missed sort of half of their time as an undergraduate. And even further, the disruption of starts of careers. There's going to be huge impacts from this, and we don't know yet what they all are. We do know they will have been felt unevenly by different people, different groups in society, depending on what people's circumstances are, depending on what people's home lives are. But I think over the next year, rather than trying to say what we think the impact has been, we need to spend time understanding what the impact is and making sure that everyone, not just schools, starts with schools and teachers, they're in the lead, but actually the whole of our society gets behind young people to say, yes, we are going to help, we're going to support, we're going to help you get back on track.
Neil, what do you think? Would you agree with Damian?
I'd certainly agree that we don't know all of the impacts of COVID, and none of us have brought our crystal balls this morning, or this afternoon indeed. I would say that the economic impact will be significant. I think we're looking at, I think I read not just that February was the most government borrowing in history, but we're looking at total debt of something in the order of £2.5 trillion. Now, I don't even know what that means really, because it's an unimaginably large number. What I suspect it means is tax rises, more attack raids on the public sector pension, and so on. I think educationally, and that's really what I want to focus my answer on, is unfortunately one of the really mean effects of this pandemic has been the amplification of what people sometimes call the Matthew effect, and that is that the rich have got richer and the poor have got poorer, in very simple terms, i.e. those students who were disadvantaged at the beginning of the pandemic have become more disadvantaged, and that gap has grown even more significantly. I mean, there's some truly shocking statistics that are starting to come forward about the loss of learning, and data from a survey that No More Marking, which I bet students also participated in, which is a survey of 25,000 students, found that year sevens nationally were 22 months behind where they should be. So that's from a 12-month hiatus, 22-month gap, which is just mind-boggling. We're seeing that the national average for things like calibrated writing ages average nationally 9 years, 7 months. In our schools, it ranges from 8 years up to 10 years as an average. So there's this massive educational deficit that's got bigger. So I think we could probably, all of the panelists, probably fill the slot talking about what that means. So I'll happily pass to someone else to take that forward. But the key, and I do agree with Damian, that we need to not focus on what's lost, but what are we going to gain from this next period? Because there really is a mandate for some fairly radical thinking, I think, in education.
Elle, as a student, what would you say?
I completely agree with Neil, actually. Well, when I was doing my research for this, I found that 97% of private school children who took part in the survey by UCL had access to a computer at home, whilst 1 in 5 of those on free school meals had no access. And the government had a laptop scheme to get laptops to all the students who didn't have one at home. But Ofcom estimated that between 1.14 million and 1.78 million children in total in the UK have no access to a device at home they can use for learning. So it's clear to see that the government scheme only targeted between roughly a third and a half of the children who definitely need one, which I don't think is enough. Also, I think the difference in hours of education, I went to a state school before coming here in September, and I've had no education from March to September. And I mean, I like to keep myself busy. So I kept myself, I taught myself a lot of stuff, but it's not the same thing. And I know a lot of people who really, really struggled coming back to school. I think that really has an impact on your mental health as well, going from no hours of school and sitting at home doing nothing to being at school, especially in a boarding school environment, going around being busy. And there was a survey, and 67% of the students, the survey was by Young Minds, and 67% of the students said that this pandemic, they believe, will have long-term impacts on their mental health. So I think that the government really needs to look into funding CAMS and the NHS so that they can deal with these issues that are going to come up in the future.
Lauren, shall I come to you? Is your experience the same? How have you felt? I'm particularly interested in devices, because I think I was, I'm probably incredibly naive here. I genuinely thought so many people, teenagers had mobile phones, and it turned out not to be true.
I think it was also a little bit the misconception with mobile phones is actually that wasn't enough. I found for me with my online lessons, I would need my laptop set up with a Zoom and then would have my phone with access to Google Classroom. It almost got to the point where I think for online learning, you needed a variety of devices to be able to fulfill it completely. And obviously the accessibility was just not available. And I think even at a state school, we maybe saw a little bit more of the struggle to get appliances and different applications and access to internet. And we live in quite a well-connected area that even here you felt it rather than an overall countrywide sense. I don't think it was felt totally. So we are a very wealthy area like Hampshire compared to sort of a suburb in London with people living in maybe say a small flat with little outdoor space. It's a very different situation to be in to say me, I had a house and access to a number of different computers, which would help me to be able to fulfill the most out of what education was there to offer. And I think I agree with Neil on the fact that the social gap is getting bigger and it is so based on this access.
Yeah. Magnus, what do you think? Come to you on the same point.
Okay, well, I've had my 3 relatively grown-up children at home for this lockdown. And the interesting word, I think, in the question is generation, because we kind of play that game, who's had it worse. If you're a final year undergraduate, second year undergraduate, if you're in your last year of A-levels last year, or if you are taking GCSEs, or younger than that. And no one ever wins because everyone's had it equally bad. So I think that pain has been shared across generations, across ages. But I think for me, it's the economic impact, because I do think that young people show incredible resilience, and some of that lost learning that Neil outlined, significant though it is, what one expects some of those gaps to be made up, however long it will take. There are, of course, lots of countries where schooling starts a lot later than it does in the UK. And I think that we will be surprised by the resilience that students and pupils, school children, young people will show. But that that ticking time bomb of economic impact, you get through COVID at school, you get through the teacher assessed grade thing, you get through your university, maybe no matter how arbitrary the application process might be, And then, 4 years down the line, you're still finding it hard to, find the right kind of work, to get the right kind of job, because there's such a long-term impact on the economy. And that's the bit, I think, that scares me most.
The next question that comes from Chloe, and this is, to what extent do you believe teachers should have been informed or taken part in the process of deciding what will happen to education during the pandemic, rather than just through the national announcement? Damian, what will you be at? Teachers more involved?
Victoria, you're very kind to come to me first. Teachers were involved. Actually, we have a very, very devolved school system in this country. I only realised quite how devolved when I started meeting education ministers from other countries. And they would say things like, we've just changed the syllabus. We've just changed the textbook. And my God, you couldn't begin to do that in England. Because actually most decisions are made at a school level, and those that aren't are made by a whole kind of ecosystem of exam boards and learned societies and others. And I think actually in many ways that's the strength of our system. We end up with quite a diverse system. When you come to the start of something like a lockdown, it has both advantages and drawbacks. It does mean that schools can decide on a sort of program of study that best fits their students. But on the other hand, quite often you get them saying, I want more guidance. I kind of want to be told. And I think it was helpful having things like the Oak National Academy and the BBC came up with some good material. I wish they'd done more television material, by the way, not just online, but they did come up with some good stuff. And so did various third-party ed tech providers. And then on sort of the big decisions, I suppose you'd separate those into epidemiological decisions, as in when a school is going to reopen, when they're going to close, does there have to be testing, which I know is a huge undertaking that schools have been going through and so on. That is driven mostly by the scientists. It's driven by the JCVI and by the Chief Medical Officer, Chief Scientific Officer. And then the other big questions like exams, of course, these things are always consulted on. There's a formal consultation process that goes on, which anybody can respond to. But they're also, and I know this from first-hand experience, you never take those kinds of decisions without talking to, for example, there's the Department for Education. There's a reference group of primary head teachers, a reference group of secondary head teachers. On other things, you talk to head teacher unions. You try to get it right, but the honest truth is there are no good answers. When you've got a global pandemic and you can't do exams as you normally would, but all these young people have been working towards for so long, there is no good replacement. And it's a very, very difficult judgment to end up making.
Yeah. Magnus, how do you feel about that? Did you feel you were consulted enough, or were you just I know there were like sort of Sunday night emails that arrived and Friday night emails, which both feel slightly bonkers.
Yeah, no, Victoria, no one ever asked me anything, okay? So I wasn't consulted personally. But I think that things are ending better than they began. Okay, I thought, think back to last year, it was chaotic, and even cabinet weren't communicating with each other, and it was very, very bad. And I think this time the off-qual consultation was a proper piece of consultation, and I know that lots of academic staff, parents, and students involved contributed to that. I think it's a great shame that it wasn't more of that earlier on. And as far as consulting, working with unions, that was pretty patchy. And as we've seen, there's an awful lot of ill will that government has tried to repair with teaching unions, with ASCL, with the NEU, all sorts of teaching unions. And that's really, that's work in progress. And the idea of trying to make teachers and students and parents feel safe about a return to school, there was very little consultation about that as well. So I think, yes, there should have been much closer, much more consultation earlier on, but then the government were really not communicating and consulting with each other. So yes, we're told one day that schools are open, then the next day that they're closing. That's not the sign of a kind of consultative process, is it?
Neil, do you agree? There was the classic one day back of the January term, which drove, I think, most parents to the gin bottle. How are teachers feeling about that? Would they have agreed with that if they'd been asked?
I think there's no question the right decision was that schools shouldn't open. I think both panelists have been very generous in their assessment of the government response, particularly, as Magnus says, early on. And it'll be interesting to see if an independent inquiry is ever held into some of the decision making and the processes. But I think from the sharp end, it was staggering, the disconnection between ministerial announcements. It felt that policy was being made up and announced on breakfast TV rather than actually in a considered and logical fashion. Now, all of us would be very sympathetic to the government in terms of the pandemic is almost without precedent, certainly in our living memory. So, you give people the benefit of the doubt, but when they keep making the same mistake again and again and again, you think, well, this is actually something more serious than just people not quite sure how to respond and deal quickly enough with what's in front of them. We have to remember as well, whilst we're giving a kick on this issue, that the government's number one risk in its own risk assessment was actually a pandemic. So why were we so caught short in our response? I mean, it drove me mad that we had so many different pieces of guidance coming out in a week. I can't remember, it was over 100 pieces of guidance in a single week. And obviously you want to do the right thing for your pupils. You want to keep everybody safe. You want to keep children engaged with learning, but you can't possibly operate in that sort of environment where guidance changes from document to document, hour to hour. And what parents find staggering is that schools didn't know in advance any of this, that you're finding out at exactly the same time as they are. So we've had parents complaining that it's taken us too long to publish a response to something. Well, we found out about this last night. We would much rather communicate with you when we've got something sensible and worked through, rather than to dash a communication out that then you have to say, well, we said that a couple of days ago, now we're doing something different. So I think there has been some mistakes made, certainly in the communication. There is, as Damian rightly says, there is a teacher reference group. My knowledge of what the teacher reference group was saying and what DFE was actually doing was slightly different things. So there's, like I say, I can understand the difficulty, but I think the communication is still not what we would hope. And face coverings have been another example of a long list of things that have made our lives as school leaders much more difficult. A very interesting piece of legislation as well in the Coronavirus Act, but perhaps we'll come back to that.
I'm just going to come back to Damian because I know he wants to pick up this point.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to agree with a large part of what Neil said. I mean, I have immense sympathy with schools trying to, he looks suspicious when I said that for some reason. I have great sympathy with schools trying to consume this huge volume of paperwork, avalanche of paperwork that comes in on these occasions. And the one thing I can't agree with though, is this thing about advance warning, because I understand why people say that. But the fact is there are 454,000 teachers employed in state education in this country, a further 400,000 adults who work in state schools. It's very, very difficult to tell 1 million people something secretly without, by the way, they're mostly also parents themselves. You can only make one announcement. I mean, that's just is the physical reality. Of course, it'd be much better to be able to communicate in advance with heads and with teachers. But I honestly don't know of a logistical way of doing it.
Well, I'm just going to go on to the next point because I want to keep us moving. And I'm going to turn to Elle and Lauren on this one. Do you feel, Ella from Bohunt says, do you feel the current way children are being educated fully prepares them for the needs of the 21st century? Lauren, do you think you're being prepared for what's coming down the line in the 21st century? And do you think perhaps your generation are more open to what it might look like than perhaps my generation?
I personally don't think we're prepared for the 21st century at all, but I think that sort of is a common theme with education, is you're being educated in a generation, in an era which you're never actually going to live in. But I do think more could definitely be done to prepare us, because at the moment I feel in school, I'm not even really being prepared for the generation I'm currently living in. I'm still being taught in the style of sort of 20 years ago. We're taught PSRE where still relationships as much as there is a more varied, diverse focus than maybe when my parents went to school, still the main focus is a mum and a dad who have children. It's not that diverse, and I wouldn't say PSRE has got the sort of importance of different relationships and how to have like different safe relationships, and it's not as diverse as society is nowadays. And as much as I understand that at the moment I'm never going to be completely prepared for whatever generation I live in, it's impossible, because who knows what technological society advances are going to come in, but I at least think we should be being prepared as fully as we can be for the generation we live in, rather than having this huge big jump in the future.
That's really interesting. Elle, what do you think? Do you agree?
Yeah, I completely agree with Lauren. I think that our generation, we're changing so quickly and technology is advancing so much, especially with the rise of AI. I think there are so many jobs that we're being prepared for which won't even exist by the time I'm an adult and looking for a job. I think that, I mean, it's kind of sucking up to my global perspectives teacher, Abby, but I think that subjects like global perspectives and history and politics, I think they're so interesting because they teach you, well, not interesting, but they should be compulsory because they teach you critical thinking, and they're the most important ones because they have transferable skills that you can apply to different jobs. They're not specialized. And I also think that politics should be compulsory pre-A level, like for children when, you know, PE is compulsory when you're younger. So I think that because we have to vote when we're 18, I feel like it's so important to know about politics and be politically involved, because we are having a participation crisis, the way I see it anyway. And I feel like if children were more engaged from a younger age, then they would be able to know what they're doing instead of just voting with their parents. And I also think that subjects like global perspectives, teaching you critical thinking could sway. I think the pandemic highlighted to us a sector of society which are easily swayed, and they are easily swayed by extreme views such as anti-vaccines and stuff. So if we educate those people to be able to look at fake news, which we've seen so much recently, then they'll be able to make that decision themselves rather than just following an extreme sector of society.
Damian, do you agree with that? Do you think we're teaching enough about fake news and propaganda and and AI and modern ways of doing this? Because it's everywhere, and it is in politics too.
Yeah, so I distinguish AI and its effects on the employment market from what Elle was saying just then about fake news. They're both important, but they're sort of separate sets of content. I'm actually the guy who introduced the new curriculum, which probably hasn't filtered through yet, but as of September 2020, the new, which fuses the computing curriculum, citizenship and RSHE, it's called Safety Online, but actually it goes much further than just pure safety online, and does include things like understanding confirmation bias, understanding why somebody might purport to be someone they're not on the internet, why people are nastier when they are anonymous than when they use their real name, all sorts of things that are very relevant to life online. I'm also, Lauren, the guy responsible for the new RSHE curriculum, which and you said PSRE, different schools call it different things. I hope it's not old-fashioned yet, because it's only been around a few months. But again, it may not. Some of that material may not have filtered through. I do actually think it's really important that we talk about these things in school. And in fact, one of the main change we made during my time in post was to make health a compulsory part of it. I mean, your school will do health education anyway, but for it to become a mandatory part of the curriculum, and both physical health and mental health. And to tie these two things together, actually, there are big links between young people's mental health and well-being and what they come across on social media, the way the relationships are different today, the way people think about their bodies and body image, and all those kind of, they are all actually at one level. They're all part of the same big subject. So yes, I do totally agree. It's important we carry on evolving that and making sure it's relevant to today and tomorrow. Lauren, you're quite right, because this is also the other problem. And on financial education, I used to joke that, you know, if we'd done financial education when I was at school, of course we would have learned about checks and endowment mortgages and all manner of things that no one's even heard of these days. So you do have to keep it up to date.
Yeah. The next question actually it sort of follows on from that, because Livy has asked, what further steps are required to ensure diversity and inclusion across schools and in wider society? So Magnus, what do you think about that? How can we make sure that we really do see that diverse that diversity we see in the general public really reflected in schools in a way that makes sense?
Okay, well, the great challenge for us is that, you know, we're an independent school just off the A3 between London and Portsmouth. And let's face it, we don't live in a very diverse area, do we? Petersfield is not a multicultural town. And to a certain extent, the schools around us will reflect the population diversity in their catchment areas. Of course, we do have the ability to have students at borders who come from, you know, all over the country and from overseas. But even then, I'm aware that our student body isn't yet representative enough and isn't diverse enough. So the challenge for me, Victoria, is to go and find students from diverse backgrounds who want to come to Bedales, and slowly we're doing well there. You know, that they're recognizing that there are people who look like them and people from similar backgrounds in the student population. Although, you know, it's a very hard thing to do in lockdown. It's slightly easier when we're allowed to go, you know, out and about and meet people. But I think it is very, very important, because when I speak to students about the world of work and the world of employment, you know, it is very diverse. And, you know, if the first time you met a Russian is when you're, I don't know, 24, 25, negotiating a contract, then that's bad. That's not going to go well for you. So I think, you know, it's all incumbent on us. And I mean, Neil has a very different challenge in his school, to try and create a diverse student population, culturally diverse, ethnically diverse, diverse in all sorts of ways. But you know, it's work in progress. It's something definitely we talked about a lot last year at the end of the summer, after that summer of turmoil and riots and all the focus and discussion about Black Lives Matter, decolonizing the curriculum, increasing diversity. So it's a very powerful discourse at the moment in this school and in all schools, I'm sure, that are like us. The closer you get to London, the more diverse the schools are. Up in Birmingham, you know, talking to a colleague there, you know, he's got a very, very diverse school population. So in many ways, you have to find the population that's diverse and move them to Petersfield.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how does that affect you, Neil? I mean, not just thinking about ethnically diverse, but things about, you know, children who are differently abled. How do you make sure they're represented in the school and in a fair way, so they don't feel like they're sitting on the margins of the school?
Well, you try to have a curriculum that is inclusive, equal opportunity for all within it. We actually have 35 different languages spoken at Liphook. So, you know, as a trust, I think that number doubles almost. So we have got diversity, but you have to look to find it, I suppose. It's not immediately obvious. And what was being really interesting, and I echo a little bit what Magnus was saying, is that it was fabulous to see students really get engaging with a topic, which was, I mean, we had a little bit with Extinction Rebellion, but Black Lives Matter had really, you know, struck a chord, I think. So I was having sixth formers and other students writing, you know, really quite well considered and constructed argument and questioning what we were doing and questioning, a little bit like Lauren did earlier, questioning the provision they'd had, you know, hitherto. And that was really interesting, because if you say to overwhelming majority of teachers, they would, your school, your curriculum is not inclusive and is not diverse, they would really bristle at that allegation, because they would say that they are, you know, inclusive, they are trying to, you know, meet everybody's needs and not, you know, in any way discriminate and confront discrimination in all of its, you know, hideous facets whenever it's found. But it's clear that that's not enough. And where the opportunity comes, and just to move us slightly into a more positive direction, is I think what the pandemic is doing is it's really helping us all question what education is. Because we have a real problem, which the last 2 years have demonstrated, that, you know, high stakes knowledge-based testing is not really fit for purpose. So what we have to look at instead, perhaps, and is row back a bit and consider what are the things that really matter. And the things that really matter are creating engaged young people who care about the world around them, want to make a positive contribution to that world, understand the world where it's come from, and importantly, because I still think you have to understand where things have come from to know where to go next with that. So I think interdisciplinary learning, the idea that be it Black Lives Matters, be it the new focus on gender inequality and misogyny and all of those things, is the opportunity here to really steer a path that is, rather than thinking of knowledge in narrow subject silos, is seeing how you can entwine these matters. So I would like to see a curriculum which is bringing, yes, you've still got to have your scientific knowledge and your mathematical knowledge and schema that goes alongside that, but let's look at that broader picture. What sort of young person are we looking to create? What are those characteristics or profile or what? Yeah, it doesn't really matter to me what that is defined as, but it is looking far more widely across subjects. So you are looking at, if you pick the example of diversity, well, what does that look like in a history lesson alongside an English lesson to what's happening in, I don't know, MFL, and how does that link so those connections are made? Because that's what youngsters need. They need to have a sense of where they are and where they need to go next, and the skills to do that, and to challenge, quite rightly, to challenge the assumption. Because I remember 30 years ago being sat in a classroom and we were talking about feminism and we were talking about gender issues, and it is galling, isn't it, really, in some respects, to think 30 years later nothing really's changed.
Lauren, do you think that's how you see it from the classroom perspective? Are you seeing the same thing? Would you like a more imaginative approach to it? Do you think you're getting enough? Or do you think sometimes it goes too far? Do you think, if they say to you, you can't study Victorian novelists anymore, you're only going to study, 21st century novelists, would you be pleased with that? Or would you be like, no, that's ridiculous?
I think I feel with particularly just the British curriculum in general, it's quite unengaging in sort of, that might sound somewhat harsh, but particularly sort of when it comes to diversity, that I think it still feels a little bit sort of tick box of, for something to be diverse, like we look at Rosa Parks, we look at Martin Luther King, and I'm not saying they're not amazing people and weren't amazing heroes, but they're famous Black heroes for liberating their rights. And similarly with women, we look at Emmeline Pankhurst, we look at Rosa Parks, and it's women who liberated their rights. And I think the lack of diversity is, you're not looking at modern heroes, you're not looking at amazing women now and amazing people from different ethnic minorities and different backgrounds and different sexualities who are doing amazing things, not just to get more rights and to fight through it, but actually just as a human and as a person, and letting people have sort of see the world for what it is, of the diversity in it. And I think that's really sort of quite backward still at the moment, and potentially why there isn't any change, because I think students, if they're not going to be able to relate to the examples which are being given in a lesson, you're not going to get them interested, you're not going to get them involved, and ultimately that's what you need. Like, it's this young age which is so important. And I think I speak from quite a difficult position when it comes to diversity, because I'm an able white female, so I have a certain level of privilege. I'm never going to completely understand what kind of diversity needs to be in a curriculum to make people who do feel that they are discriminated against, because I haven't experienced that. I don't have an understanding, but I feel as a female student, I know sort of the difference I've felt of, we study history and it's primarily men, and I'm not looking at anyone who I can particularly relate to.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important that at a young age that there is sort of regulation and understanding of how careful teachers must be in not letting potential biases which they've had from growing up and they've lost out on because they've been taught in a certain way reflected into young people, because that's how it is created. That if you're telling an 11-year-old girl that she's rolling her skirt for boys and her knee is distracting boys from education, that's going to create a generation which, when they're older, sees that it's okay to blame the girls for having shorter skirts, rather than having sort of an attitude which is, you need to wear a longer skirt because we all need to be equal and all need to be the same. And so it's not some sort of competition, not because of the impact it's having on another gender. And I think I always feel that if I can relate things back to how I feel with sort of the male-female gap, then I assume that there is a somewhat similar idea for other minorities who want to have more diversity and influence in. And I imagine there's similar issues for, say, people who are transgender or people who are non-binary, who find that there are things which are said by teachers where there is a lack of understanding and education on what's right and wrong. I can imagine that they feel similarly to how I feel about being treated differently for being female.
Yeah. Elle, how do you feel about that? Is that something that, again, it's to resonate with you?
Yeah, I really agree with Lauren, and I feel I really like that Livy said to ensure diversity and inclusion, because I feel that diversity is like being offered a seat at the table, but inclusion is like being able to be part of the conversation. And I don't agree with just giving people, like, having boxes that you need to tick. I mean, as I'm Latina and I've worked really, really hard throughout my school life, and I feel like I've been told that I only got places and things because of my ethnicity, and they needed to tick a box. And it feels so like it discredits your whole work, like everything you've been working for. And I think that we need to, rather than try and get people of colour or get women or get people of like genders which aren't within the gender binary to come to your place, you can tick the box and show off that you've got such a diverse workplace or school environment. To tackle the issues at the root. So I think we need to teach more about the, like, decolonizing the curriculum. Like, I learned about slavery, but I knew that with the Cold War especially, it was very from like an American perspective. And I think we need to learn about the UK's racist history and stop sugarcoating our past. And we need to teach more about how to include people into our curriculum. And I think unconscious bias training should be made like something that every school needs to go through, and people need to go through at work, so that we can get rid of our own prejudices that we all have. And we need to include like more representation. I think the representation in the media is one of the biggest things, because if you can't see a role model to look at, then you're not, that's one of the biggest factors actually that people are less inclined to go for top positions. So I think if we have more, like if we celebrate more women who overcame their struggles, if we like have more representation of CEOs who are people of colour or people who are non-binary or transgender or gay or lesbian, then I think that that's the way to go about ensuring diversity and inclusion rather than just having boxes.
Well, it's very interesting because Emma has just put up into the question and answer, what are you doing to make PSHE or PSRE education more inclusive of LGBTQ plus relationships? And are you committed to fostering a more accepting atmosphere? So Damian, I think that comes to you because you have just overhauled that part of the curriculum, and as you pointed out, people may not already have seen it in action. Is that part of what the aim is? Is that where we're going anyway?
Yes, I mean, well, it's different at different ages. So the approach to RSHE, the guidance starts with, when you're 5 and 6 years old, it's about trying to be nice to people and trying to understand that people are different, and some people may be lonely and some people may need friendships, some people have different home backgrounds, and we should try and understand one another. Then obviously as you get older, then you introduce more about intimate relationships and some of the the issues that people are more likely to come across as teenagers, and it does include learning about all types of sexuality. I should stress that government doesn't write guidance material. Writes guidance. It does not write the materials that you see in school. There are a range of organisations that do. One of which, for example, is Stonewall, and I've got to imagine that the materials that Stonewall have are properly. I haven't actually seen the most recent ones, but I imagine they are properly diverse and encouraging young people to look at the range of these matters. But absolutely, we have to understand, appreciate the way that our country is, the way the world is today. Quite apart from the fact, by the way, that we have equalities legislation, which means it's required of us to to think about these things in the proper way. There were loads of things that came up in the earlier conversation, by the way, Victoria, that I wanted to chip in on, but I'm gonna hold myself back because I think I might take up too much time if I did. But this has been an immensely important discussion. I was particularly taken actually with Eleanor's phrase, which I hope she doesn't mind if I nick. The point about, diversity is. I think you said diversity is a seat at the table, but inclusion is being part of the conversation. I think that's absolutely spot on.
Yeah. So look, I'm going to go on to the next questions because I know we haven't got much time, and this always happens. But this is so we're going to do a political question now. So Damian, coming straight back to you, does the panel believe NHS workers deserve more than a 1% increase in pay? If so, where should the money come from? Says Jake.
Do people who work in the NHS deserve more than 1% increase in pay? Yes, of course they do. Yeah, absolutely. And so do care workers. So do people who've been working on the front line, keeping essential services going. And I think in this pandemic, we've had a completely different view of what essential services covers. It covers having your bins emptied. It covers being able to shop in Tesco. It covers all manner of things. And all of these functions have carried on going. And I think we've all had a renewed and heightened awareness of how we all fit together and an appreciation of what everybody does. But of course, those in health and in the care sector have been absolutely on the front line in harm's way, personal risk, getting us through this. And I've no doubt that I don't think there's any question of desert on this at all. I think the questions end up being more ones around practicality and around the overall financial situation. So, in the last year, private sector pay for many people, most people work in the private sector, and many of those have seen pay falls as a result of the pandemic. Some of them have lost their jobs altogether, and I'm afraid that there is probably more job loss still to come, because there's still, the furlough system is still in place, the business support system is still in place, and we have a very, very difficult economic time on our hands, and there's some very difficult decisions having to be made. There is an overall board public sector pay freeze, apart from lower paid people who are earning less than £24,000. There's an exception being made to that for the NHS. I think that's right. There should be an exception, but now the independent pay review body will look at the submissions, look at the evidence put forward by different people, and come up with its recommendation. But whatever its recommendation is, whatever the final pay settlement is, I don't think you can quantify. I don't think you can measure up to, could any amount of increase in pay recompense or fully recognise the contribution that these people have made. I don't think it can, because it's literally been a matter of life and death.
Rather than go to the rest of you this, I'm going to go straight to the next question, because the next question is from Grace, and she says, what does the panel believe was the greatest mistake the government made over the pandemic period? So, Elle, would you like to start us off on that one? What's the government's greatest mistake, do you think, has been in the past year?
I think not enforcing lockdown earlier and going for the herd immunity approach. So if we look at countries like New Zealand and Taiwan's had only 10 deaths during the whole COVID situation, and Jacinda Ardern put the country in lockdown on the 16th of March. 16th of March, they had to isolate, and anyone arriving into New Zealand had to isolate for 14 days. And they're very, 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 very strict on lockdowns. And now we can see that they're back to normal. And countries that prioritise the health of their citizens actually had the least economic impact on their country. So the UK, I think we were trying to prioritise our economy during the beginning of the pandemic, but we've actually had a worse toll on our economy. So I think that if we had followed other countries who enforced lockdowns, enforced mask wearing, and had more guidance on mask wearing, because I think, I mean, at the beginning, I definitely thought that masks wouldn't do anything. I think there was a lot of conflicting evidence. I think that was the worst mistake that our government did.
Magnus, what do you think? What's
Okay, I think that if the government record was an essay that I just marked, I'd be handing it back covered in red ink, and there'd be no ticks on it at all. I think there'd be more mistakes than honestly, I think it'd be more mistakes than a drunk youth taking a driving test. It's catastrophic. But in terms of money spent, okay? So 3 billion quid on these, and they don't work, of dubious accuracy, 6.2 billion earmarked to be spent in the future, 15 billion for the rest of 2021 to 22. And we were talking earlier on about nurses and pay rises. And I just think that there's an extraordinary imbalance between the amount of money, of our money and borrowed money that we're going to pay back one day, that has been spent in a wholly irresponsible and catastrophic way. And I think that there have been literally so many mistakes, I don't know where to begin. But I think that to echo what Elle said, I think not so much the first lockdown, but in terms of impact on schools and another 6 months of lost learning, then the easing of restrictions and poor old Rishi's eat out to help out, which I took far too much advantage of. I'm thinking I was doing a good thing. Little did I know that I was letting the virus back in and spreading infection. And that, that led to the second lockdown in December. So I think that was really bad judgment and bad timing. So I'm sure that Damian can look for the silver lining on this particular gloomy cloud, but I'm struggling to do it myself.
I'm going to get to Neil next because I can see Neil's got a few thoughts.
I'm just smiling. I think, Magnus, it's too easy, isn't it, to knock the government's record over COVID. So I don't think I can pick a single thing, really. Clearly, numbers of deaths, maybe Elle's right. Magnus is right with the huge waste on new and untried equipment. I'd throw into that the absolute cronyism and awarding of enormous contracts without following any sort of law or protocol, personal contacts, just the whole thing. I look forward to seeing if we ever get the full independent inquiry into the handling of the pandemic, and then to see quite what happens as a result. Because one thing that's disappointing is that just it feels dishonest. There's been so much about the pandemic that to me has felt that, that we have not, that ministers have not been honest, and for when we understand that we're not going to get the truth the whole time, but it's just become acceptable to swear black is white one day and then the next day the opposite, without there being any sort of sense that this isn't how politicians should behave. I think it's a sad indictment of the whole country, if I'm really honest, that Piers Morgan became the only person holding politicians to account.
Lauren, what's your verdict?
I mean, I definitely agree with Neil and Magnus. There are so many mistakes. It's be easy just to pick one of them. But I actually think the overall mistake was the lack of cooperation with other parties. Like if you look at World War I and World War II, which I would probably argue are the two most similar events in recent times, where you've had the whole country battling something so massive, there have been coalition governments. Rather than this time, the Conservatives chose to take it on themselves. And as much as they could have taken all the glory if it had been really successful, they have ultimately taken the full failure. And I think the knock-on effect has been that every time lockdowns or different announcements were made, there was some responsibility held on Conservatives. And whenever you leave that just to a political party, there could be a knock-on effect in an election. And similarly for Labour, Labour have been very difficult. It's been very difficult for Labour to fully criticise because they can't rip apart what's happening because it's following the science somewhat. But then again, they're still trying to please their voters because they know they too want to win the next election. And I think if at the beginning of the pandemic, there had been a conversation and a decision where all major parties cooperated together, I think decisions maybe would have been more focused on actually what was going to save people rather than the constant underlying, yes, but I've got to win the next election as well, which you can argue and say that it hasn't influenced. It's obviously going to. It's the government in power. It is going to have an influence because that's the main aim, is you want to get re-elected. And I think as it's shown in World War I and World War II, which we did win, those coalition governments, that is the time to use it, because hopefully after the next election, we're not going to have to go through another pandemic. So you didn't need to vote on how well the government could handle a pandemic, because hopefully you'll never have to do it again. I'm more interested in the economy and education and NHS, which are going to continue on. It should have been it's a national issue, it's a global issue. There should have been cooperation to deal with that in the best way, rather than this constant. And I think, Neil, you said about cronyism, about how focused it was, and it was the same people. And again, it's the support of the Conservative Party, and it's been sort of maybe the party wanting to please those big supporters and those who fund, rather than necessarily looking at the bigger picture. I think it does boil down to, if I could say one major mistake, I think it'd be Cummings. I think the issues surrounding Cummings would be the biggest mistake.
Okay, so now I'm feeling very sorry for Damian, because he's got to answer that, and there's been a lot of flack there. But I will point out that in the polls, Conservatives are still doing very, very well. So, you know, whatever people are feeling isn't currently being reflected in the polls. Can you explain it all to us?
Well, first of all, can I say I agree with a great deal of what the very, very good points that Lauren has made throughout this session, as has Elle. But I do disagree with Lauren about one thing. It's not the main purpose of being in government to get re-elected to be back in government again. The main purpose of being in government is to serve our country and to try and serve the people in it as well as you can. And I have to tell you, my friends in the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, and every other party, that is what politicians are focused on. And quite often it's not what people see, but honestly, that is the truth. That's what you try and do. Part of that, of course, is you tend to think that your party's programme is better than the other one. And so you can't do anything unless you get into government. That's where elections come into play. But elections aren't the purpose of politics. Public administration, serving your country, is the purpose of politics. Just on the party front, I should also say as well, there's a lot more cooperation goes on than is sometimes apparent. And of course, the vast majority of analysis and so on is done by officials. You know, Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, so they're not political appointees. They're people who give advice, and they give exactly the same advice, whether it was the Labour Party in government or the Conservative Party in government. They have equivalents in Scotland and Wales who try and give their best scientific advice as well. And then ultimately ministers have to make judgments, and judgments are hard. They're really hard when you've got an unprecedented situation. There is no manual for how you deal with a global pandemic. We have not had in our lifetimes anything remotely close to this. Even the last time, 1918, when there was an equivalent, in epidemiological terms, equivalent virus, we didn't have the same kind of connected world that we have today. And Britain, by the way, is one of the most internationally connected countries in the world. It's not the same as New Zealand or Taiwan. When people said earlier on you should have closed the borders, well, how are we going to get food? We are a trading nation. How would we get scientists in to work on the Pfizer vaccination rollout? How would we exchange, academics who are working globally, collaboratively, and across Europe on these matters? We're an open country, an open economy, and that does have knock-on effects. Look, have mistakes been made? You bet they've been made. There have been loads of mistakes made, and there are definitely lessons to be learned, and we will have to have a proper inquiry. In fact, I don't think it's one inquiry. I think it's a whole bunch of inquiries. We have to have an inquiry over. We were talking earlier about education. We could talk similarly about various aspects of the public health response, about what's happened in business and the economy and elsewhere. Those lessons must be learned. But please don't imagine that ours is the only country where people are having this conversation. We tend to think we are terrible at everything and everyone else is doing it well. You need to look at a French newspaper and a German newspaper to see what people in those countries think about what their governments have been doing. And if you ask about specific mistakes, I know I'm going on too long, Victoria. You're a politician. I'll just keep talking. I do apologise for that. Of course, there are mistakes made. The early stages of the testing programme. Some of the PPE provision obviously wasn't good. There have also been things that have been done really well, and I think we should remember that too. And in this current phase, in this vaccination program, again, if you look at those newspapers in other countries around the world, actually other people are saying, look at these. The United Kingdom has done a really good job here.
Yeah. So in fact, I know we're coming towards an end. I can see. I'm sure Polly's going to shout at me soon. But I can see there's a couple of extra questions that have just come into the Q&A box. So if we could just get those, then I'll feel that we've managed to hear some people. One's a question specifically for Damian. So you'll have to make this quick. Government guidance has meant that school lateral flow tests cannot be trumped by a more accurate PCR test, which means thousands of students had to wrongly self-isolate for a further 10 days, missing out on contact teaching time. Are we going to address this issue?
Yeah, to anonymous attendee, it's a very good point. It's not the first time this has come across my desk. I've heard it from other people, from constituents, from parents. I totally get the point. And I'm not medically qualified enough to get into the detail on it. My understanding is this is the more cautious approach, and because the priority is on overall keeping schools open, that is why this element of caution is there. But I take on board what you say, and I will have it in mind when talking to ministers and others.
And the other question, I'm sorry, guys, the other question on the QA is also for Damian. It's from Michael, and he's asking, in light of earlier discussions regarding representation and diversity in education, what are his thoughts on Michael Gove's reforms to the history curriculum, including a large amount of British colonial history?
So I do get asked this kind of question fairly often. I'm never really sure what it means. I mean, as Neil was saying earlier, when we were at school, we did also learn about aspects of empire and aspects of Britain's past. I don't remember having been taught a glorified version of British history. I really, really don't. And I don't think that's what schools do today. There is certainly no edict from government. And any educationalist on this call, by all means, contradict me, but there is certainly no edict from central government that says you may not learn about diversity or says, you have to be taught some sugared version of British history.
One more question I've noted here, which I think would be quite interesting, which is from Tashi. And Tashi says, does traditional and social media have too much power to influence our society? If so, what would the panel do about it? Let me come to Elle first. What do you think about social media and traditional media?
I think
can it be curbed in some way? Should it be curbed?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, because we don't want to come to a place where we're sort of monitoring what's going on and shutting off things that are in the media. But it does have, I think the media is probably one of the most influential sources, especially like social media for my generation, but also what we see in the news and movies and media. And I think that it's hugely influential. And especially with the coronavirus, we've seen so much misinformation about the virus, which was spread on social media. And we've had a huge rise in hate crimes against Asian people in the UK and in America. And my family in Brazil, especially, are very prone to believing fake news, which breaks my heart. But I think that there could be something done, definitely, in terms of specialists that could, I know on Instagram it comes up with a little pop-up if it's fake. Sometimes it's like, this is fake news, or this statistic isn't right. I think that could definitely be developed further, and have like people who are professionals in critical thinking and like analysing statistics, who could flag up things that were fake, not take them down, but flag them up so that people could therefore go and do their own research. And maybe if an article came up about more information or something, I'm not sure, but I think that definitely something needs to be done, but we need to be cautious about how we go about it.
Neil, what do you think? Do you think people actually really understand what fake news is? Do they get that?
I think young people are getting much better at discerning the difference between it, and that's not a unique age phenomenon. I would say, to answer that question, two things really. One is, are they too powerful? Well, traditional media, social media, any media only has power if people give it power. You choose. I think that's really important, and we hopefully as schools we educate people in how to make informed choice and apply some sort of framework to working out what it's saying and why might it be saying that. And the other thing is, I'm becoming increasingly conscious of getting old, because I genuinely do not understand why millions of people follow vacuous plastic people in the sunshine and give value to what they are doing and saying. And I know I'm a dinosaur on this, but I just can't, I've got a teenage daughter, I just don't understand. And I think that's me now crossing from being a force for change into being a resistor to change, which is dangerous territory, I think, for school leaders. So maybe it's time to put me out from the dotage or something.
See, I have to go straight from there to Lauren and say, Lauren, is Neil a dinosaur? I mean, is this
I I think the thing is with social media is I think there's definitely sort of misconceptions with it, and I know I feel it with my parents as well. When it's sort of taken about 10 years ago, Facebook was the way to go, and now they are now both on Instagram. And I think it's sort of got to the point where, yes, that is a massive part of social media, and that is part of its downside, and it's undeniable. There needs to be a greater increase in regulation on social media. I think when it comes to sort of looking at freedom of speech, when it comes to traditional media, it's quite difficult to make it any more restrictive. But I think social media, that's where the changes can come in. Ultimately, they're being run and people are making millions of pounds out of it. So they need to take responsibility and start putting more control in and using it for the greater good, which it can be used for, rather than just the idea of sort of Love Island style stars making more and more money.
Magnus, what do you think about it? What do you think about fake news and social media?
Now, I'm interested in the long journey card game. If Neil were a dinosaur, which dinosaur would he be? That's going to get mileage out of that. But no, I think back to the power that the press barons of the past wielded through print media, and that's definitely my thing. And I obviously it's a kind of postmodern act when I read a newspaper on a Saturday if I have the time. But I think I do worry about Zuckerberg and his ilk as the kind of the Randolph Hearst of the current era, and I just think it's very damaging. I don't have an answer to it. My previous school was so remote, there was no phone signal, there was no 3 or 4G, there was nothing, and there was a timelessness and a serenity and an ease in young people's lives that came from that, and that I think is a very rare thing. So I don't have any solutions, but I worry. And I worry about phone dependence, and I worry about social media dependency. And I just think anything we can do to walk away from the screen, to walk away from the phone, to speak with each other, to connect on a personal, real level, is all these things are antidotes to the terrifying cult of social media.
Yeah. Damian, do you think, is this a place for legislation? Is this something government should intervene in, or do we have to find another mechanism?
Yeah, so first, I agree with Magnus Bashaarat with pretty much everything he said. Neil, by the way, you'll always be an influencer to me. I've always thought of you in that way. And never a dinosaur. Yeah, media and social media, yes, hugely powerful. It's not always actually themselves and their own views and so on that you need to worry about. It's the way the model works, the way the algorithms work, the fact that you make more money the more shocked and disgusted people become at the output that you're churning out, and that encourages too much aggression online. It encourages fake news, and encourages all manner of things that we should be trying to deter. We've got a debate actually coming up. I'm going to speak in the debate on Wednesday here about online anonymity, which I think is an interesting angle, interesting part of it. And then more broadly, there's legislation coming, the online harms bill we're expecting soon. An interesting discussion going on here is the distinction here, I'm in Parliament today, is the distinction between individual harms online, so where you can identify a victim when a specific thing happens to that person on the internet. Everybody's agreed that more needs to be done about that and more responsibility from the platforms. But then there's also societal harms, where you can't necessarily identify immediately somebody who has been personally hurt, but where we know these things undermine our society. And that includes things like aspects of fake news. It includes things like undermining democratic institutions, increasing aggression and incivility online. And I don't know where we're going to go with that, because it's a lot harder to legislate for, but personally I think it's just as important.
Did you see, Damian, another question has just come up, which I think is really a very fine question. There's an ongoing act silencing protesters. It's the crime bill that they're changing it. Will it mean social media, the protests get louder on social media, and could there be more problems? You suppress a protest in one area, it pops up somewhere else.
Well, on the first half of the question, there is no such act.
Okay.
Protest is not only legal, it's important. And protesters and protesting will carry on. I think the bill that the person's referring to, I think they're talking about the crime and sentencing bill that's currently coming through Parliament.
Yeah.
That does not ban protesting. It does mean you can't do things which stop other people going to work, getting their children to school, visiting hospital, getting an underground train, those kinds of things. It absolutely does not stop people protesting. Protest is fundamental to our democracy. Our democracy actually thrives on it.
Okay, well, that's great. And I think everybody would agree with that. I'm going to have to close the meeting now. Thank you so much, everybody. Damian, Neil, Magnus, Elle and Lauren. Thank you all for your contributions, and I hope everyone's enjoyed that. Do fill in your feedback.
Thank you, Victoria. And thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.